The audit committee disclosure issues and otherwise. I'm joined today by Rani Doyle, a dear friend of mine who's worked with me at the SEC. She's also been in-house. She's worked at law firms, and now she's a principal for the advisory practice for KPMG. We're going to talk about the audit committee today on realtransparentdisclosure.com. All right, Ronnie, we were just talking offline for a second about your first speaking gig, which was many years ago. We won't say how much, but you become such an accomplished person, speaker. As I said in my intro, you've done the four different types of law that you can, which is in-house, regulatory, law firm, and now you've done two stints here of something completely different, working for KPMG. It's amazing, really, what you've accomplished in your career, and you've got far to go. You're younger than me. But the audit committee, I know, is one of your favorite topics, and we're going to talk about disclosure issues. So the first question I have is, this is a bread and butter topic, last minute or never ending changes to the earnings script by the CEO or someone else in management. How should that be handled?
Well, I think this is a company specific topic. Some companies have this problem to a very serious degree. Other companies don't have the problem. They have a really locked and loaded process. But today, I think there's a lot of nervousness, justifiably so, around what is the right message to give today in earnings. And people lose sleep about it. And so when the CEO wants to change the quote, you have to be really respectful of that desire, but you also have to be respectful of the process, because last minute changes make everybody a little crazy, and it invites the opportunity for errors, uh, forced errors, so to speak. And so I think it's always been the case that the CEO will always need coaching by those who report to the CEO. So I think as much as the investor relations team, the FP&A team can hold the CEO's hand and stay in constant contact as that press release is first developed, making sure that you ask as many questions as you can to elicit all the CEO's sentiments, all the CFO's sentiments that you possibly can, scenario play around what the right quote is instead of just taking the first quote that IR thinks is a good one, really stress testing the quotes, stress testing the message early on will hopefully obviate the need for last minute changes. But when they happen, it's really hard to tell the CEO no. And so I think having a good process is good, but sometimes you might just have to say to the CEO, no, not unless there's a good reason.
And like you said, it's a company specific issue. I worked in when I was in house, the CEO really didn't like lawyers. And so I sometimes had to go to the head of communications or the head of IR to deliver a message because it was more well received by the CEO than getting a knee-jerk reaction because it was coming from a bald man. What about audit committee changes to SEC filings when they're just trying to prove that they've read the document? I know when I was an examiner in Corp Fin, like you were, it's hard to review a filing and give no comments because then to your boss, it looks like you didn't do any work. And so sometimes you might draft comments that otherwise might not get drafted just because you don't want to hand in a blank piece of paper. I'm not sure that happens in Corp Fin anymore. I think they do review filings and not give any comments. But back in, I know for me, I never did that.
Well, I think board members do like to prove their value. The audit committee has the primary responsibility for looking at SEC filings. And so a lot of them like to prove that they're doing their job by giving some comments. Just like we talked about with the CEO, you have to respect that process. But I think there's also, and I might sound like I'm a subversive advisor here, but I also think that again, it's very company specific. Some companies, if you get a comment from the audit committee, you just need to implement it because it's the right message. Sometimes you get that random comment that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, doesn't add a lot of value. And then you have to ask yourself the question, what's my response if I make this change? What's my response if I don't make this change? And sometimes you can choose a few different paths. You can just ignore the comment and proceed with the filing because it's not material. you could implement the comment because you can live with it. The other thing is to talk to the audit committee or the director about why are you issuing this comment at this time, and we're ready to print, or we're ready to lock and load this thing into Workiva or whatever the system is. How strongly do you feel? But again, this is also an opportunity to make sure that you're having those discussions about disclosures early, and that you ensure that when the audit committee meets to discuss the SEC filing, that the discussions around the filing are very robust, so that a board member or an audit committee member can prove that they've done the work through the discussions that are had on the filing, rather than giving a random comment. So again, it's such a big question, and there are multiple different responses. But if you do get that random, I don't really like how this is worded, you know, what is the culture that you have with your board, or what's the relationship that you have with your audit committee and board? And on a case-by-case basis, just take the easiest path to do the right thing.
And I know that some filings, some SEC filings are on a compressed time schedule, particularly 8Ks, where you have 4 business days, right? 4 business days.
Or business days. Sometimes I get confused with Section
I was
16.
trying to say 4 business days, that seems like a lot,
I know.
but it's not. Everything's getting, I mean, the T plus 3 plus 1. I mean, it's crazy how things have been compressed. But the audit committee sometimes needs or wants more time than you have to review an
Yeah.
SEC filing. How do you manage that process?
Uh, I think we've done some studies that show that audit committees are taking less and less time to review filings than they have in prior times. Um, but there still are audit committees that will want, even at really large companies, 5 business days to review an earnings release. And I think in today's world, that's just not really feasible, because inevitably something will change. A number will change, a number will need to be tweaked. And you don't want to necessarily have to go back to the audit committee with those changes. You want the filing to be as much baked as it can be by the time you give it to the audit committee. So it depends again on how quickly the business of the company is changing. How much are the disclosures changing? For example, tech, fintech, uh, energy companies. Some companies are experiencing more, I'll call it, seismic changes to their disclosure, just because of the environment that we're in. And you have to maybe give room, but there's ways to socialize issues to help hopefully avoid those last minute changes. But sometimes if you're looking at an earnings calendar or an SEC reporting calendar, and I do this with companies sometimes, I'll see that the board is, or the audit committee is having, you know, substantially more than 2 business days to look at an earnings release. I think one thing that is very useful is to show data that's available from numerous sources about what our current audit committee practices. And you can see this shortening of time for the audit committee to review an earnings release. And then if you show this data point to audit committees, you can get them to change their calendar. But you also have to give them some confidence that shortening that time period isn't going to hurt their ability to do their job. So giving them a draft, perhaps, or having, some touch points when you're doing the, whatever dashboards you're sending to the audit committee. Keeping them prepared is one way to give them comfort that shortening the period is the right way to go.
And we started this conversation off talking about last minute changes to earnings scripts and trying to manage that. But sometimes you have last minute changes. So we have 6 scenarios to talk about. The first is significant typo. How do you handle that?
uh, that's an interesting question. If you're talking about if a filing goes out with a significant typo.
Yeah.
Well, that hardly happens, but when it does, it's a disaster. Um, and you need to take the immediate steps to correct that typo, especially if it's a material typo. Um, I'm thinking about a different answer to your question, which is, what is the process that you put in place to avoid that typo to begin with? And I think it touches on all the things that we talked about before. How do you take the pressure off so that last minute changes to important public disclosures aren't made, or that the changes are so numerous that people get blind to what's in the document that you're about to file so that they miss the typo? Or when you have diffuse responsibility so that you've got 10 people who are proofing the document. So when you have 10 people proofing the document, it's almost like, okay, so who's really responsible for making sure that everything is ticked and tied? Sometimes the allocation of that checking can vary between IR, the FP&A group, legal, and when the processes aren't clear, that's when you can have a significant typo. When you do have a typo, we've seen this before. The thing is to immediately address it. Just the standard rules that public companies need to adhere to when they notice an error. If it's in earnings, that response better be pretty immediate. If it's in an SEC filing, also pretty immediate. Um, the better question is how to avoid a typo to begin with.
And what about a last minute development and new information that's come out that you're about to press the button to file down Edgar or send out the earnings release? How do you handle that?
Well, I think you probably have had this experience where you're about to file an S3 or you're about to file a 10K, and then some issue comes up. Someone has a question. Ooh, is this cyber thing material? Ooh, is this HR development material? And that's when you call your lawyers and you get the best advice you can about what do we do? Do we make the disclosure? Do we stop the presses? Do we have a delay? The market hates delays. If you're going to file something, you need to file it on time if you've indicated a time for filing, um, which is really only the case with earnings. But we've all been through this process, and it's not fun. And this is again why I think having a really robust disclosure committee, uh, having really strong people in charge of the disclosure so that they can make the decisions and the calls. To force the process to be good to begin with. I think you tell me if you're hearing this, but 10Ks and periodic disclosures still can seem pretty routine. Everybody's busy. They're looking at the last draft. They're making their changes. There's so much going on. I do feel like people are more distracted. I feel more distracted than I used to feel. And so how do you make sure that your disclosures are smooth, robust, and typo-free? It really boils down to the process and the people and also your technology. And so I think nowadays, uh, all the companies that I work with are using various technologies to support their disclosures, including FP&A, data collection, getting things done earlier, making sure the close process is smooth, making sure that FP&A is holding hands with IR, throughout the process. Again, my focus is always on earnings because in my opinion, that really is the crux of all public company disclosure. Even I take the view, Brock, and I'm going a little far afield here, that a good governance program is ultimately reflected in your earnings call. How well is the business doing? How is the performance operationally, financially, and even on a sustainability level? Can you make disclosures that show that your business is strong, moving ever more towards sustainability? And you can't do that if you're looking at the process in a routine way.
Yeah, I mean, the SEC filings still have an element of being a compliance document, whereas the earnings is not. And that's why some companies, have gone away from quarterly earnings to semi-annual or annual, just because it takes the pressure off them because they have to really put much more thought into what's mentioned in a earnings release and an earnings call than what's in a periodic SEC filing. I agree with you.
Well, that's interesting because I'm not sure I think earnings are a place for creative disclosure. Uh, but I do think the ways to communicate performance are multidimensional, and uh, the earnings release is maybe the best way, but there's other vehicles too. You've got investor presentations, you have your sustainability reports and other vehicles for disclosure. So it's really again like what is the company's style and culture and who are their stakeholders that they're communicating to? Is it really just the street, or are they trying to create a a different message for a broader community?
Yeah, I'm not postulating they'd be creative, but that's the CFO and the controller and their teams are really looking at the earnings probably more closely, the earnings release than they would for a periodic report. It depends how each company is structured. When I was in-house, that document was controlled by the CFO and the controller, and not necessarily legal would review it, but not drive the bus. Let's
Well,
talk about it.
IR often drives the bus, and legal has to make sure that the footnotes are correct.
Yeah, and forward-looking statements and all that, which we're going to talk about in a minute. What about a new 8K event just before a shelf takedown?
Interesting question. I have had so I had this is a the question that you're asking raises an important moment in my career when this actually happened. And it was late at night. It was about 10 o'clock. I was in the office at Morgan Lewis. My client was about to file an automatically effective S3, and they called with an issue, and they wondered, do we or don't we have to file an AK? And uh, it was, I was a partner, and as such, I felt the full brunt of responsibility pretty much for the first time. Who was I going to go to answer this question? And it seemed to me that the situation was easy enough to analyze, but talking it through with the company, we had the CEO on the phone, the general counsel, it was full court press. Uh, I did call some of my colleagues, one of my best mentors, Linda Griggs, you remember her. And I think it was a full court press. What do we do about uh, this issue? We actually decided, hand on heart, this was not necessarily an 8K event, but if the company were going to file the S3 and then make disclosure afterwards, what would the market think? And uh, so we were willing to write the opinion, to let the S3 go and have the 8K come afterwards. But I think the company huddled and they decided that their investors broadly would probably feel some lack of trust, even though this 8K event, there's 8K events that are material, and then there's 8K events that, they're all material de facto under the law. But some 8K events won't necessarily change your stock price. And some 8K events are not even wholly unexpected. So in this case, the company did decide to delay the debt offering, but I do think in situations like that, you have to have great SEC counsel. You have to get probably a good set of perspectives, because if you make the wrong call, not only do you have the market impact that could, be negative, but you could also have the SEC questioning, what did you do and why? And what if you have an error? You don't want to get that lawsuit. It's tough.
Yeah, I can't imagine. But having Linda Griggs advise you is can't do better than that.
That's for
What
sure.
about miscommunications among those on the disclosure team, the disclosure committee?
Uh, well, I think that's just kind of human nature. People will have different priorities. different pressures. Uh, Sometimes on the disclosure committee, I hate to say it, you have turf battles. Someone wants to be in charge of something that someone else wants to be in charge of. Sometimes you can have a lack of transparency even among team members. Maybe that's driven by a corporate rationale. Something is brewing, but it's kept a secret until the 11th hour, and then that creates problems for the disclosure committee. So I think one benefit of getting older is that you realize that human entanglements, human disagreements, when you're allegedly supposed to be cohesive and all rowing in the same direction, are sometimes inevitable. And disclosure, I remember someone saying this to me, and I hated the expression, but I think it's apt. It's sometimes like making sausage. The process is ugly. And um, and I think when disclosure committee members disagree about a fundamental issue, the the calendar is moving and decisions have to be made. So once again, this boils down to who is the strong leader that can say, discussion over, this is what we're doing. And that same leadership is hopefully going to be present in all of the discussions that we talked about before. What happens when the CEO really wants to make a last minute change, or the audit committee wants to make a change that maybe might create more confusion or noise, or is just not helpful. Who can have the candid conversations with people so that you just cut off those time wasters, I'll call them. And some companies have the ability to have those conversations and have the discipline to ward off the time wasters. And sometimes you just got to build up to that point.
And what about when it bleeds into sort of the debate about a non-GAAP presentation?
Well, the non-GAAP rules are what they are. And I think the SEC is commenting on non-GAAP rules all the time. It's a perennial source of SEC comments. And I do know that companies have the ever-present desire to reflect their performance in ways that maybe don't comply with the non-GAAP rules. But at the end of the day, the non-GAAP rules have to win. And anybody who wants to circumvent them needs to lose.
And we touched on this time rush errors, having a strong disclosure controls and procedures process. And I guess practicing mindfulness, getting people to breathe and not to rush is, trying to build that into the process, which, I mean, the law firm I'm affiliated with now, there's a lot of mindfulness offered within the firm. And same thing with the last law firm I was with. So it's been really good to see that that's happening in law firms.
I'm so glad to hear that because sometimes, so from my seat now and for a long time, I have little short views into a lot of situations, including a lot of high pressure situations. And I do feel like everyone is really rushing. They're rushing from one meeting, one issue to the next, to the next, to the next. In-house, hopefully the pressures aren't quite as high as if you're at a law firm or you're doing what I do. But even in-house, I think people are being asked to do more all the time without necessarily more resources. And so they're experiencing their own time rushes. And I'd love your perspective on this, I do feel like even though every white paper for the last 5 years has started off with some lame sentence like, in this time of unprecedented change, uh, that has been true. And it's a cliche, but if you were ever going to use that phrase, I think it's probably going to be applicable to now and going forward. The change that's happening, I think, is very more unforeseeable than ever. And I think people do need to spend more time thinking about what is the disclosure that we need to make, but the disclosure can't diverge from the company's strategy. It has to always communicate the strategy. So one way to avoid time rushes is just go back to, okay, what is our strategy? Has our strategy changed? Has our FP&A process changed? Has our business model changed? If those things haven't changed, then like what are we creating stress about? And then maybe the question is, does our strategy need to change? Does our business model need to change? Do our KPIs need to change? And if that's the case, you really have to think super carefully about what those changes are, especially if you've been reporting for a long time, because the market doesn't want to see change without a clear rationale for what it is and what it means. And I have a lot of sympathy for people developing corporate disclosure now because it's hard. Technology is making it a little simpler if you have the right technology and the right resources, but people have to make the time. And audit committee members will say conflicting things. On the one hand, our meeting time isn't enough to look at this SEC filing. But on the other hand, if you ask them a different question, like, are your audit committee meetings of the right length? They might say, yeah, they're about the right length. So what's the right answer? Do you have enough time to review your SEC filing, or are your meetings too long? How do you make a calendar both for corporate disclosure development? So that's your earnings calendar, your SEC calendar, your the close process, that omnibus calendar, how everything fits together like a puzzle. How does that work so that people don't feel so stressed that you're coming up with suboptimal product? And maybe you only need to think about that twice a year because you can't think about it every quarter, but you have to make the time.
Yeah, I worry that AI can save us all time, but as a result of that we all get less resources because we're expected to leverage AI so much, and then we start relying on AI and not checking its work. And of course, we need to do that, and even make errors about using it in a way that the information is not kept confidential. I mean, the next topic, forward-looking statements and legends, actually lends itself to having AI improve that language. I think if you have a sandbox closed system where if you're talking to AI, it's not getting put into the model what you say to it, and so it's staying within the company. Um, to me, that's a good way to have another set of eyes, so to speak, technological eyes, look at what you're drafting for forward-looking information and seeing if it could be a way so it's better understood by other human readers or AI readers, in fact, that are often, I don't know how much AI is reading your forward-looking statements. They're probably, I guess it's reading the whole thing instantaneously, but maybe not focusing on the legends.
Well, that's probably a really good source of information, actually, the legends, because the assumptions that are underlying forward-looking statements are usually there. Um, but just going back for 1 minute to AI, I've seen firsthand the power of AI to generate amazing benchmarking and amazing draft disclosures. And I think that tool is inevitably something that people are going to use. Um, and it sort of raises some of the issues that relate to just disclosure as it is today. If you get too confident in what you already have, you're going to potentially make mistakes. If you get too confident in what AI is generating, you're also going to potentially make mistakes. And the other thing with AI is that you might lose the company's voice. I think more and more companies are wanting to have they've got their brand. So an SEC filing is a regulatory document, but I do think companies are trying to convey their brand in a tone, in a type of disclosure that is easy to read, um, and is otherwise reflective of, you know, their brand, so to speak. So using AI has a lot of benefits, but obviously it raises some risks. On the forward-looking statements and legends, uh, where companies are making forward disclosure, the assumptions underlying them need to be articulated. And I think that is pretty interesting, especially with all the change that we're seeing around tariffs. You know, some companies are dealing with tariffs in, you know, again, some companies are affected greatly by tariffs, others not so much. Some companies are trying to quantify the potential impact of tariffs, some are not. Uh, but those forward-looking statements and legends are your liability shield. So they need to always be carefully looked at, and they cannot be, uh, you know, viewed as a legal kind of shackle. They're actually the opposite. They give freedom to make disclosures if you properly couch them in the right cautionary language.
Yeah, it's important and also important to make sure you're consistent. What the forward-looking statement you have on your website is being updated at the same time as you're updating them in the earnings release and investor presentations everywhere. Every time you update them, you got to remember your corporate website.
Yeah.
And let's finally touch upon ESG. It's in the news a lot. Audit committees, their role with ESG these days.
Well, um, I think there's a lot of noise, obviously, around ESG, and that's kind of unfortunate because it pulls attention from the fundamental idea that ESG, if properly interpreted, really is, in my opinion, a, a synonym for long-term value. If you are any kind of company and you identify the material, environmental, and social and governance issues that you need to be addressing to implement your strategy, your stated strategy, and to meet your stated values, then that's a long-term value play. And when all of us read in the news every single day that there are environmental problems that humans are dealing with all over the world regularly, whether France is going to be 120 degrees in the summers in 5 years, or we're going to have more wildfires, or there's a water shortage, or whatever the issue is, or with data centers. A lot of the very successful IPOs these days are around technology and data centers. Those very modern companies, full press technology companies, they have to think about sustainability because the energy demands and the communications that they're having to have with the communities where they're setting up their operations are material. And so ESG is still an important issue. And I don't think I see that the issue is going away. It's just people are becoming more tactical about talking about it. And I think that's actually a good change. None of us needs to read greenwashing. I think it's better as technology is facilitating, more concrete data that can support a company's analysis of what is a material ESG issue for us and for our stakeholders, and then make the right communications about it. I think that's going to continue to be, and it should be a priority.
No, that's good. So thanks so much for your time today, Ryan. This is awesome. So great to see you.
Thank you. So great to see you.
Bye.